You're
This
muting.
conference will now
Muting.
be recorded.
Right.
Did I say unmute?
I thought you
Okay.
did, but
So welcome everyone to the webinar. This is our 8th and final webinar of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's winter webinar series. My name is Vicky and I'm the coordinator of the OIPC, and I'll be hosting today's webinar from Peterborough. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping notes. So I've placed all attendees on mute to eliminate background noise. And today's presentation will be about 45 minutes. And at the end of the presentation, you'll have a chance to ask Sandy some questions. So if you have questions, just place them in the chat box and I'll go through them and read them out to Sandy at the end of the presentation. Before we start, I wanted to also thank the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry for their support of the OIPC webinar series. And thanks to everyone who has tuned in and listened to our webinars, whether this is your first time joining or you're a return customer. This winter, our series have highlighted some of the really great invasive species removal work happening throughout Ontario and beyond. So today our focus will be on the state of the urban ravine system of Toronto and the work of Sandy Smith and her colleagues to assess the biodiversity and ecological integrity in the Toronto Ravines, and specifically looking at the recent report of the Toronto Revitalization study that came out. So before, I'll give just a brief bio of Sandy Smith. So Dr. Sandy Smith is a professor in the Faculty of Forestry at the University of Toronto. She specializes in forest health and is a leading expert in the ecology and biological management of invasive forest species, with a recent focus on the urban environment. She's cross-appointed to the School of the Environment, UTSC, and Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, the University of Waterloo, and Algoma University. Sandy has published over 140 journal articles and book chapters in the area of forest health and urban forestry, serving as a reviewer for international journals and on national science committees like NSERC and provincial scientific panels for managing invasive insects, including Asian longhorn beetle and emerald ash borer. Her research addresses ecosystem resilience and the natural control of forest pest species, including invasive insects, earthworms, and plants. Professor Smith has taught over 30 graduate and undergraduate courses, including professional online training courses, and supervised over 65 graduate theses in forest conservation. She is a Min Yang Scholar in China. Is that the pronunciation?
yep, that's close.
Okay. A fellow of the Royal Entomological Society in the UK, past president of the Entomological Societies of Canada and Ontario, a strategic advisor for LEAF and Ontario's Invasive Species Centre. Sandy currently serves on the boards of the Forestry Futures Trust, Toronto Parks and Trees Foundation, Tree Canada, and the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. So welcome, Dr. Sandy Smith, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Vicky. And I knew I should have sent you a shorter bio, but I don't have a shorter. I was hoping you would edit into a little shorter, but I'm happy to do this. And thanks for the intro, and thanks to the Ontario Invasive Plant Council for being interested in this topic at the moment. Hopefully my screen can be shared here. Do I have to say share?
So I've just made you the presenter, and yeah, now I can see your screen. Yeah,
we're
right
on. Okay.
All right.
This has been an ongoing project. It was initiated by Eric Davies, a PhD student, with myself, as well as with two former colleagues who are current colleagues, but who initially set up this study, Paul Scrivener and Dale Taylor. There's been a whole number of people that have contributed, and I've listed a couple of names here. Anki Dong was working directly with Eric, and Catherine Burka has joined our group, and Lydia Wong has done some work with us. And as I say, there's been many. Excuse me. So I think I'm just going to launch in and try and sort of give an overview. I wanted to create a context for this. I think people may be surprised that a forestry faculty is looking at it, or maybe not, but it's been a long-term interest for our faculty. If you go back to, we were the first forestry school in Canada in 1907. excuse me, and the Furnau, the first dean, he's the guy with the cap, the dapper cap leaning against the tree there, came from Prussia and was very interested in urban forests, and in particular the ravines. Naturally, there were a lot more forests in the area at that time, but it became sort of one of the pieces of interest, and it's a place where the concept of the term urban forestry was first coined. And so the focus is on forest restoration and specialty forestry. And this is his first book from his lecture notes, The Care of Trees in Lawn, Street, and Park, which is what they were focused on at that time. But over the years, this has really branched out into ravines. One of our former alumni and professors, and who was the provincial forester, Ken Armson, and he's been very important in forest stewardship and programs around the province, wrote a really interesting book in terms of our forests, Ontario forests. I highlighted there at the middle, and I think that's important. Order of Canada and recognition of kind of the work that's been done. As I said, this started really with Eric Davies and the City of Toronto. We're trying to work on the Ravine strategy document that they needed to get out. And I was invited along with Eric to participate at the initial start. I think that was 2015 or 2016. And of course, it captured Eric's imagination, as ecologists were very keen on this, and we had this history in the faculty. So it was sort of launching and looking at saving Toronto's ravines, because once you get down into them, while everyone appreciates how green and lush and wonderful they are, when you start to look at the ecological changes, you get a little more nervous. So this is the group, and I've listed a couple of other students here: Alex Stepniak, Joy Kabing, Jane Mitchner, and Jack Richard. All of these have contributed. And if you look at the actual proposal, or the report that came out, there's links to all of their theses there. So the details are very much in their professional masters of forest conservation theses that they produced over the last couple of years. As I said, this started back in 1977, and we thought it timely in 2017 to do a 40-year review. Paul and Dale, who did the original report or spearheaded that, it was published in 76 and got formalized in 77 for the Rosedale Ravines. And this just gives you an idea of what they used to look like, these reports, when they came out. This report was not alone, and I'm showing this complex matrix because I had Lydia, one of the students, look at this, and what's kind of interesting, she pulled out 12 documents at that time. You'll see on the horizontal at the top, all the different ravines were looked at, and the 70s seemed to be a very exciting era. And there were a number of university professors who got involved with this, especially in Toronto and at the faculty. And I've highlighted vegetation here. So Lydia identified a number of areas where there were concerns, even in the 70s. And you'll see the red boxes here represent, for any particular ravine, a particular topic. And I've highlighted, sorry guys, I'm hearing feedback there, but
thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Cool. And so you can see, which I think is rather interesting here, is invasive plants. The first one under vegetation, every single ravine already was highlighting that. And the asterisks, there's 3 of them there that are asterisks that say, even though they weren't specifically mentioned, they record those plants in those ravines. And if you expand this, and the other interesting thing is that lack of tree regeneration, only one of those ravines identified that as an issue. So for a forester, this would be particularly concerning. Lack of tree regeneration means that they're already not on a very strong trajectory. If you pull that apart and look at a little more closely under vegetation, which I've done here on this slide, and I expanded invasive plants. And again, I thought this was interesting when Lydia was able to pull out from each of these reports. You will see that Norway maple, non-native bush honeysuckles, and garlic mustard were being flagged by 9 out of these 12 reports. So again, all of these listed on the left side here are important, and it depends on the ravine where they are. Also important, not quite as much as those other ones, are buckthorn, of course, and Japanese knotweed. So even in the 70s, these plants were already appearing. I flagged here with these arrows along the top the 4 ravines that were revisited from the 1977 study that we followed up for our report. These were the 4 ravines. And again, you can see they're probably representative of the whole collection. So one of the professors involved was Bob Jeffries at our faculty. Some may remember Bob, eminent ecologist, Nobel Prize winner for climate change. And you can see where these ravines from the original study are actually located here in east central Toronto at that time. And this is basically, we remapped them. We were able to identify them. They had, Bob and his colleagues, the students working then, had really good records. We didn't have those electronic GPSs. They didn't have what we have today, but we were able to go back and get very, very close to those original sites to go back and resurvey. And if you look at it, it's not a large area. It's only about 50 hectares, a little over. Each of those ravines were slightly different. And so a total was about 50 hectares. These were the questions we asked when we went in. And the big number one is, how to measure ecological integrity. And we're not the first to ask, nor do I suspect we will be the last to ask this, and try and grapple with what is it that we actually want to know. It's not necessarily biodiversity per se, but this ecological integrity. What is the current status of it in the ravines? And of course, most importantly, where is it going? What's the trend in ecological integrity over time? Now, just to frame this a little bit on ecological integrity, and I'm not going to give the hours of lectures that some of my students are subjected to, but I've worked on forest health, and I do equate that to ecological integrity as best as is possible. And one of my, I guess, mentors, not that I know him personally, but someone who I respect tremendously, is Aldo Leopold, of course, his Sand County Almanac. But there's been a lot of recent work too on forest health. And basically, when you get into these science journals like the lower right there, they talk about forest health, but really they're describing, I think, what ecologists would talk about ecological integrity. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, beauty, and stability of the biotic community, and it is wrong when it tends otherwise. Now, this idea of ecological integrity, it's not just ecologists, but of course the provincial parks and conservation reserves have used this in 2006, the Act, and then the 2014 edition, Ontario's Protected Areas Planning Manual. And I've just again pulled out some quotes and highlighted maintenance of ecological integrity shall be, of course, first priority. So trying to set that as the goal and the vision, and then trying in the new Act to define what that might be, a condition, and the focus here is composition and abundance of native species and biological communities, and rates of change in ecosystem processes are unimpeded by our impacts. So again, using these as frameworks, this is what we sort of took to try and capture and measure ecological integrity. And so we did a resurvey, trying to be as rigorous and scientific as possible, to go back to those plots and those ravines and look at ecological integrity in the framework of EI. And that was composition, abundance of native species, and which is much more difficult on a short-term study as we were doing, but looking at affected populations, functioning cycles, unimpeded ecosystem processes, etc. So starting from Leopold, right through Parks Canada, the EPA in the US, Ontario, and of course Toronto today, and it's in the Toronto Ravines strategy, big discussions over the Rouge when the national park was set up. And I put at the bottom 2020 and plus for Toronto, because hopefully trying to aim to continue to use this as a framework or underlying any of the strategies we develop, in particular the Ravine strategy and what's currently in draft review for the city, the biodiversity strategy. I think as ecologists, we would want this as the underlying process. Looking at ecological integrity, and I'll come back to my forestry background, I guess, and not specifically the faculty, but someone here like Erin Ellison. Again, ecologists see trees as foundational species. So people always think I'm biased on trees, and actually I'm an entomologist by trade and heart. So I say, yeah, I think trees are important. I think they're important because other people who are much more knowledgeable in that particular area have identified them as foundational species. So we need to track those. And there's a long history in forestry, maybe less so in North America, but certainly in Europe, of how to manage trees and forests successfully. So these foundational species can be retained or restored depending on what's needed. This idea of foundational species then builds on with someone like Dan Jansen, an entomologist, a colleague that I do understand in terms of the ecological interactions and his concerns, and entomologists and ecologists, from my perspective, this is what we're more worried about, is extinction of these ecological interactions that are key to ecological integrity. So it's not necessarily what you see in front of you, but what escapes the eye is more insidious in terms of loss. And so losing foundational species and losing those interactions lead to bigger challenges and are tied to ecological integrity. And of course, I end with today a good colleague and a fellow entomologist who has also branched out, become more engaged in natural systems and bird conservation. But Doug Talmy, who spoke, I think it was last year or the year before, at the TBG in Toronto, about native species and rewilding and how we can make sure we bring nature back home. And so very much inspirational for Toronto Ravines, the direction we should be heading in. And his whole point as an entomologist is that these are these layers that we all learned in early school about the platform of foundational trees, the interactions, and then of course species like birds that many of us are much more familiar with than all the insect pieces, that birds need these interactions, and in this case 7,500 caterpillars to rear one clutch of young. So this is work that sort of talks about that pyramid that we know and recognize, and very much all these sort of mentors and colleagues have focused on this idea that native trees provide these ecological interactions in a much more dynamic way than non-native trees. And on the right, I show the non-native sort of truncated pyramid. And of course, over time, evolutionary time and adaptation, that pyramid, some interactions start to occur, what we call today novel associations or new interactions. It's not like it's completely blank, but the original interactions are disrupted, and the concern of those unseen or extinctions that start to occur. Anyway, that was context to give background to EI and the thinking that we approach these ravine studies. As I said at the beginning, all the details are in these individual reports, and they are linked if you get into the link on our website or get the final report, which is very much a summary we produce. But within there, you can link to these more detailed studies by students. And that resurvey took, it ended 2017, but it took several years. And basically it showed a large decline in what we were defining as ecological health. Granted, we didn't look at all the pieces, but we looked at some key pieces. Tree canopy cover as the foundational species. There was some acorn forecasting to look at regeneration, some seed collection, small mammal bird resurvey, understory veg resurvey, and policy analysis. As you'll see at the end, this has become an important piece. So if you look on the left here, the circles, this is Eric's worldview, and he has this, if any of you have heard him speaking about dark diversity, that's the black circles here. Dark diversity represents native species that used to be there, so they're extirpated, locally extinct, whereas the green are still there, they're native species still there, and the red represent introduced or species that aren't native. So if you look at Toronto's current tree species pool, this is broadly, we had 73 native species of trees, so this is focusing on trees, of which 30 of those aren't, they're called extirpated, which means simply that they're not viable reproductive populations. You might still find some of these individuals, but they are not going to be there into the long term. And of course, there's 72 new species that have been brought in, so about 115 species. If you look over at the Ravine study that we looked at, there's many more species that aren't present in the ravines, 53 of those that have gone locally extinct. There's still some remaining native species, and there's some new introduced species. So what I tried to do with these arrows is just capture that the ravines look to be in not as good shape even as the broader Toronto pool, as you might identify. When we went down into the ravines, and these are from 3 of the 4 plots that we set up, you look at the native tree species richness, the presence, there were 20 in those 3 ravines, and non-native there were 9. That was back in the 70s. And if you look today in 2016 when we went back, it's roughly the same for native species, but what's rather interesting is that the invasive species of trees have increased. Not quite double, but obviously going up over the 40 years. The other way to look at this is not just presence, absence, but abundance, so the relative number of tree stems. Again, as a forester and thinking about foundational species, how many stems are there? How many young ones are there to move forward? And again, if you look at the 1977 report here, the 3 studies, and it indicates here how many plots we had set up. But looking at native species, you have 85% of the stems were native trees at that time, and only 15% were non-native. If you go today, looking in 2016, it was 60% were native and 41%. So not only do we have decreased native diversity, we also have increased invasive species. So in terms of abundance, percent abundance and number of stems, it's even more apparent than it was with just presence absence. And this is just to show that when we broke out those plots or the different ravine sites in percentage abundance, as we said in 77, each of these ravines are slightly different. And Rosedale, the one on the right here, is the one down at the bottom. So it's closer to urbanization and development and has more use than the other ones. And so even in 77, it wasn't surprising to see that it had more of the non-native species. Today, these are even more so. So the 3 that were reassessed, all of them have increased in the percentage abundance of non-native species. And of course, the more southern ones seem to be more serious. What was interesting was to break this apart a little bit and look spatially and then make some predictions. As I said, some of our concern or question that we asked is, well, what's the trend? Given that the number of stems are changing and we can quantify that, if we looked in 77, only on average, and this is taken an average, about 10% of the trees were non-native. So this is a map that the students and Eric put together, and it's hard to see at the top here, the little red dots, but 10% of those red dots in this one ravine site are considered not native. And this again, these aren't actual sample points, but they're estimates within these plots. But in 2016, when we go there, we start to see 40%. So you start to see a change. And I apologize for those that may have green-red color blindness. I always tell the students, you know, never put red and green together, but and I guess it's natural and intuitive to want to make the non-natives red. Anyway, for those who can see it, you start to see the red really starting to take over. And so we made this prediction, so what happens in a few more decades, if we take it forward 40 more years, then you know, if this trend and this projection continues in this direction and rate, then we're going to start to really see ravine sites that are much more red than they are green. And so these are, I guess, where alarm bells or concerns from our end is, What we're doing right now isn't good enough. I think that's basically the status quo isn't good enough. We may see it, many people or most people may see those ravines as green, but in fact their trajectory is not in the direction that we would need for ecological integrity and for the forest health is slipping. And if you walk in some of these ravines, this is early spring, Google, somebody's walked down there with their backpack and got the Google walk photo here, and you can see it's very open. There's very little understory. There's very little herbaceous plants, and of course there's very few seedlings that are actually going to be there for the future forest, and there's a large number of Norway maple. So when we looked at vegetation, I haven't put all the details, but again, they're in one of the reports. If you want to look, there were 61 different vegetation ground cover species that were surveyed in plots. 31 of these were native and 30 were non-native. And the study itself actually flags them as severe, moderate, and just trace. So you can actually see how they were ranked in 2016. We also, as I mentioned on these different reports, as we looked at small mammals, because the original studies did look at small mammals as well, and there was trapping that was done, but only 3 species of small mammals, these guys, the white-footed mouse chipmunk and common shrew, were we actually able to capture. Excuse me. And so one of the studies, this wasn't specifically in the ravines, but people deposit specimens into the ROM, and we were able to go back and look for the city of Toronto, and a large number of these would have come from the ravines over time, but you can go back to 1866 when they first started, specimens start to appear at the ROM in the collections up until 2015. And we flagged there's 4 of these species that sort of stood out. 3 of them, the meadow vole on the upper left, the red squirrel on the lower left, and the deer mouse on the lower right, all 3 were declining. So I've put some numbers there, and it gives you an idea from the early 1800s how many were being collected. And this isn't an average, but it's a summary over several decades to provide these numbers, and it's a trend that was clear across those years, whereas the masked shrew was going up. And to me, it's unclear why masked shrews are going up. As insectivores, I suspect there's more insects on the ground that they're able to be able to feed upon. And that may represent shifts in the understory vegetation, the fact that voles are going down and squirrels that are more herbivores. Certainly the voles does always signal that there's certainly changes in that lower vegetation structure and species. We also did birds because those birds were surveyed in the 70s as well. 1-hour bird surveys in each of the ravines, and again here you can see we found 46 different species and 146 birds individuals that were identified during that time. This is going to be difficult to see, but again, going back and looking at what you would expect to find in Toronto, so potential GTA area sensitive forest breeding birds from Environment Canada's list, and there's a number of these 63 here, or sorry, 43. 7 out of the 43 area sensitive forest breeding bird species were identified, so only 7 out of 43. And 31 out of 118 species native to Toronto. So it was a short recording period. It's only 1 year. We all know, like small mammals, birds have different population fluctuation cycles, but it does indicate that there's a lot less than there was originally over time. In the last couple of years, we've expanded looking the mapping of the plant vegetation, certainly the invasive species, and I'll show you some pictures of those maps in a few minutes. We're also, one of the focus, this is Eric on the right, Eric Davies, and the other student, Alex Stepniak, doing some mapping and seed forecasting of old growth native trees to engage communities, and I'll I'll close on this piece that is sort of the forward thinking about what can we do with the ravines. If you look at the mapping, it's a sort of a distance map look at Japanese knotweed in one of the ravine systems, the Vale of Avoca. And Alex and Eric surveyed this, I think it was 2 years ago, when they walked through and made counts, measurements of the size of the patches. And in the lower left, you can see they converted it to patch size based on square meters. And the size of these dots here indicate the size of the patch that they measured as they walked down that ravine. From the top, the submap 1 walked down, mapping all along that ravine system. And there's extensive knotweed all the way down in this short vale here, and fairly extensive. So the question is, when you go into those ravines, who's responsible at some level? And this has been a piece of our concern going forward, is are these the private landowners that may have the good fortune or the ability to own ravine properties, or is it the public land, which is TRCA in the City of Toronto? If you zoom in on submap 1, that's that top one, that very large cluster of 1,200 to 2,400 square meters, the big circle is there right by the number 2 on the right here. And what we did was overlay the City of Toronto's property maps onto this larger scale map that gives you an idea of where these patches, these Japanese knotweed patches, actually are, because this will now help us to target options for management, and whether it is individual homeowners or whether it is actually TRCA and the city. And so this is where we're moving forward. The key thing, gives you an example of one of the properties that is actually here on the left on the ravine. So they do own this pathway that is running up to the upper left. This property owner does own a significant piece of the ravine, and you can see the knotweed down in the bottom, as well as there's some Norway maple along the side. And in fact, when you're on these pathways, and this is the Vale of Avoca example, you can see how extensive knotweed basically is the understory. And it's, to some level, is actually keeping the banks of the ravine intact, because when you consider it, to the right of this picture is the actual water stream, the course on the right, and we're very close to the edge. And if you were to remove that knotweed without some other strategies, you would lose the soil and there'd be extensive erosion. So basically, the short report, where we tried to summarize all these individual reports, it was left with this overall conclusion, looking at the Toronto Ravines, that the ravines are at a tipping point. So again, coming back to an ecologist perspective, is that we're losing diversity. This means we're losing those interactions. We're losing the native species of foundational trees, and that's affecting the other vegetation, which of course, when you start looking at small mammals and birds, you will see this sort of cascading or upward cascading effect that's going to happen. And at some point, when will those ravines become pretty much monocultures of a few key species that probably aren't native? And I should mention, as the entomologist, they did look at insects back in '77. We weren't ready to tackle that at this point, to sort of show the interactions between the vegetation and the vertebrates, but it's still to be done, and I think that will probably show up very similar trends as what we saw with the vertebrates. The second point is natural heritage could become a green monoculture. So I've talked about that, that if this trajectory keeps going, then we are going to start to see something that we might, if we haven't actually monitored or assessed carefully and critically and strategically, we're going to see it as green, but our natural heritage won't be as healthy and the ecological integrity will not be there as it has been in the past. And the report really tried to flag this. Some people have challenged that we were a little maybe overly putting too many strong adjectives onto it. However, I believe that our point was that it will take immediate action. Even if we have immediate action, it will take many decades to restore the ecological integrity of the ravine. So we can't sit around and say, oh, they're still green and things seem to be okay. We need to get on this. We've had all these wonderful studies done in the ravines in downtown Toronto in the 70s. So we have great baseline, and we can now continue to move forward. And so it's important that we take this trajectory and get involved, because the do nothing option, which is kind of what I would argue we have probably been doing, thinking the ravines are fine and healthy. The do nothing option isn't really working. It does question whether we are at a tipping point. And in fact, we're not alone on this. I know a lot of people in the city were concerned, and I use that city broadly, not just the city of Toronto, but more broadly, when people start to think that maybe their perception of what's in the ravines as healthy is not as healthy as they had anticipated. So even the TRCA watershed report cards in 2018 flagged, and this was presented at Parks and Environment Committee in the city in 2018 last summer, said basically we're holding steady, and they assigned the ravines a grade of D. And D isn't good enough from my end. It does pass you, but as an academic, it's not the place you would want to be. Holding steady at D is not moving forward into a very positive trajectory. So our team and I'm pleased to work with some really wonderful people, and I'm just the spokesperson today to speak about this. But Catherine Burka on the left and Paul Scrivener in the middle, and Enki Dong spoke several times to Executive Committee about the Ravine strategy. Eric's at the bottom, Parks and Environment Committee. There were a number of deputations. The councils were very supportive and got on board. Politically are trying to make changes. The city itself has released the Toronto Ravines strategy. I know there was lots of discussion about whether we could or should, or how useful it would be to use ecological integrity, or EI. But if you look at the top part here of how our pictures show the ravine, you've got to look at the bottom part, which is what we're seeing when we go out onto these sites, that not only is there a lot of erosion from mountain biking and other activities that of course people want to use in the ravines, but that it's affecting the understory in general and the trajectory. I've often heard people make comments sort of, well, people either think the ravines are fine and keep them green and move forward, or they think they're basically, it's the city of Toronto, so how could you expect anything to be healthy in the ecological system here? So there's different reasons for why ravines look like the lower half of this picture. I'd like to think they aren't. We can't let them continue in that trajectory. Here's Eric. The other thing that we're trying to do is raise awareness with citizens. Try to think about where citizen science can work. Here, Eric is leading a group on looking at the different trees, identifying, thinking about, this was a fall tour that he did, talking about acorns and collecting from these mother trees in the ravine systems. Again, people think there's not many many people think, oh, there can't be that many great trees in Toronto, but in fact, there's some really ancient mother trees that are still producing lots of good acorns of native genetic stock here. There's also been a lot of news stories with our report. We actually brought this to the attention more broadly. Even The Guardian in the UK picked it up, and we're very interested. And I must say, as I started this work, or Eric and the team started on the work, I was thinking, yeah, the ravines. I'm not originally from Toronto, so I don't think I really appreciated until I start looking at the data and we started discussing them, what this green network, this sort of artery throughout the city, and how unique Toronto is having these ravine systems, and that we can't keep letting them go in the trajectory that they are. So Eric, of course, has hit the news in many ways. This is actually Eric. He's convinced his landlord, and this is downtown Toronto on Palmerston and College. He's convinced his landlord to let his front yard, and his front yard, you can see the size of the front yard, that he can put in a box, and he's got acorns from white oaks. There was a good masting production of acorns last year for white oaks, and this is Eric in the fall planting, and of course collecting neighbors, sort of thinking about where does this go? The one man's quest to restore native Canadian trees to Toronto. And so I think it's topics like this that put the positive spin on what we can do rather than, oh, isn't it terrible? So I just wanted to sort of closing here is look at the recommendations for the from the report. Again, they're fairly broad, but adopt and restore ecological integrity. I mean, this is what, as ecologists, we're adamant about. It means increase ecological connectivity and buffers for biodiversity. Again, for ecologists, it's pretty straightforward. What does it mean in ravines? You know, avoiding salt, making sure we have permeable pathways and materials used for those pathways, reducing paving where possible, making the ravines need to be accessible to be clear how that gets balanced with impacts ecological. Second point is regenerate and reintroduce, so seed forecasting and collection, which is where Eric's focus has been, is getting involved in seedling production. We're working with 3 private schools, pilot projects at the moment, and these are average citizens and average people getting involved in how to make sure that we have seeds and seedlings and saplings into the future. Plant local native trees. We're looking at these opportunities. Again, citizens can get involved in this. We need to rank invasiveness and remove invasive species. This is legislation, but we need to get more involved in this. It's sort of unclear messaging at the moment from the province and from the city of how we will handle this, and maybe this is something where the Ontario Invasive Plant Council can get more involved, not just in Toronto, but in other places. I mean, we think we're going to need to do some thinning of the Norway maple. A lot of those non-native tree species that I didn't name, but are primarily Norway maples that are really proliferating. And I wouldn't say all Norway maples are invasive, but certainly the ones that have got into the ravines, the provenances that were brought in, and nobody knows much about those these days, but if we can go after them, we're going to probably need to do some thinning and Japanese knotweed removal for sure, but there needs to be a comprehensive plan, because as the image of the knotweed in the ravine showed, we can't just cut it down. We have to have a plan for restoring and replanting. Re-engineer lawmaking and enforcement. This is something that's become, when you're in the city and you've got more people and more interests and concerns, then we really need to think about the legal barriers. How do private citizens work with the public? And it leads into the second point, foster collaboration partnership, rather than sort of saying it's all on the city or TRCA to do this. There's actually many private landowners and the kids and schools that want to get involved. So coming back to ecological integrity, to me it generates forest health, it derives from diversity, but diversity is not only species diversity, but those functional, foundational native tree species, genetic diversity that aren't clones, and of course habitat diversity, age class mosaic, which again for a forester is really important that be sustained or maintained. And if you get this biodiversity, you will have ecological resilience, which is what we're after in the long run. And I'm using some of Eric's slides here, but forest health is species diversity. So this is just a random collection that doesn't signify all trees, but talking about the diversity of native trees, they're green here. Many of them have already been lost, as the original circles I showed you, the black, green, and red. Here's the dark diversity, the species that sort of are already out of the mix from the city. We could look at putting some of these back. There may be some opportunities for that. If we don't, we get this downward trend, not only in species diversity, which is shown by this arrow, like on the left, but also in the size and age class structure, because we start to get smaller and smaller trees. So we start to drift towards what the circle up there talks about, the lost dark diversity. If we don't go in and try and reclaim some of that back, that's appropriate. We also need functional diversity, so it has to be, or, as an ecologist, I would say we want those native species if we can. Right now, this is the non-native species that we have out there, sort of proportionately. This just represents proportion. We need to, again, think about these non-native species, which ones we're going to keep and which ones we won't. I'm not the purist that my student Eric is, but I do think there's lots of room for some non-native species, and certainly if we're looking at assisted migration and thinking about climate change, we need to anticipate these. So, but I think we need to be a lot more careful about how we make those decisions, and we can't just let nature take its course as it has in the ravines. And I wouldn't say it's just nature, it's us and nature on our trajectory. So citizen science, as I said, Eric's been down this pathway. He's very strongly committed to this. He's building on Henry Koch's work on growing trees from seeds. There's some great information that will, on the right, give us the biodiversity that will bring the ecological integrity to those ravines. I mentioned age class distribution, and I put it in this slide. If you think about it, it's much like the birds feeding how many insects they need to raise a batch of young. This slide simply shows that you need 500,000 acorns, that's on the left, to get 10 mature trees. That's a healthy age class distribution for a forester. So you would expect to see 10,000 saplings. You would expect to see 250 mid-crown trees. So this is what we're aiming for, is a healthy age class distribution. How do we do this? Permanent plots, prioritize restoration, erosion control. I've talked about some of these as I've gone through: control and removal of invasive species, collecting seed and regeneration, and stewarding with the public. Citizen science, this is Eric's map at the moment. They're mapping, these yellow dots do represent mother trees, older trees that are producing seeds. And it's not just out in other parts of Ontario that we do this, but it's right down in the ravines where there's some excellent trees for the future. We also have to look at creating a new operational funding model. I think we kind of agree that there's some challenges, and it's not so much a question of what, although that's an ecological question, but who and how do we pay for it? There's lots of obstacles in the city for this. The invasives are marching on, however, and so we can't ignore it. There's been a great, last year, or end of 2017, New York City put out their Natural Areas Conservancy. It's a really great way to move forward. There's lots of accolades that have been put out about this model. And so we need to sort of look at this model and try and adapt to it. What the framework provides insights into the forests and sort of talks about the 25-year investment that's recommended if they want their healthy forests. It's a joint project, so it's the NGOs, not-for-profits, and the New York City parks. So it's a government, private, public partnership. They have about 3,000 hectares there over 25 years. They estimated 385 million. One could laugh at that. We sort of converted that for Toronto. It's 11,000 hectares of ravines that we have. At about over 6,500 are on public land. We estimated it was about 500 million over 25 years. And of course, that seems formidable. But if you think about it, it's $7 per person per year for 25 years. So it's breaking it into what's manageable. So what we need to do is focus on the future. One of the initiatives, I just thought I'd put it in here, is what they call sustainable sites initiatives. People may have heard the LEED certification for buildings to make them greener. Well, this is a new program, and it's a certification system for landscapes. Why stop the environmental sustainability at the envelope of the building, but take it to landscapes in cities? So soil and vegetation are important. So just to end on this note, keep and rewild Toronto's Ravine. It's what we need to do as we continue to build this massive city. And please download our final report if you'd like. It links to those other reports. And I want to thank all those students and citizens who have been really engaged in this and continue to support moving forward on making changes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandy. It was really interesting and a bit sobering, but there's also a lot of potential for hope and building a healthy ecosystem.
I hope so. Like, we wanted to end, we had to flag it as, you know, don't ignore this. We can't afford to ignore it. But on the other hand, there's some good things that can happen. Once you admit you have a problem.
Exactly. So then if you have any questions, just write them in the chat box below. We have a few questions coming in. There was a comment earlier in the presentation about the mass shrew numbers, that the increase may be reflecting earthworms as a food source, which are themselves invasive, like cormorants increasing due to zebra mussels.
Yeah, good point. I hadn't thought about that. I've done some work on the earthworms. Of course, I'm interested. I hadn't thought how much, yeah, but the shrews, that might be a response to them, because I was puzzling over it myself. I mean, what you see in other studies with earthworms, some of our work and in the US, is that when earthworms move in and aren't native, they shift population, so the vole population does decline because you lose the mycorrhizae in the soil and the mushrooms and other herbaceous plants. So that actually fits into that argument. I like it. Thank you.
Another comment, especially agree with the plan to change and assist our natives. How can we assist to change bylaws to ban non-natives being grown in private homes? I suggest a bylaw where natives have to be grown on the public portion of home lawns.
Yeah, I mean, if there's some way we can get at that, it is so complicated because you get in cities, the differences of opinions. I mean, I think, like the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, one of the good places to sort of focus on is the landscape nursery industry, where people get these plants, and to get more knowledgeable. If you could bring laws in, I mean, we did it for the aesthetic, the pesticide, bylaw for aesthetics, right? So perhaps you have to get everyone on side, or the majority, and that's always a challenge.
Yeah. And this would be a challenge too, but it would be great to, there's a comment here, remove every Norway maple and replace with native oaks. That would be great.
Yeah, and I can hear my student Eric cheering in the background on that one. And I agree. I mean, I think Norway maples, and I'm not cutting them any slack, but they're not all the same. And I think we have to be careful because they became such a cultivated plant, and they were selected. So I suspect, and if we get more data on this, that some are much more of a problem than others. And so, yeah, I mean, in some places that may be the only thing that'll grow. I mean, I've often said that about a tree of heaven. So I don't know. They may not support insects, but at least they shade and mitigate temperature.
Right. I was somewhat surprised to find mostly dog strangling vine in Highland Creek, even in shaded area. Very little garlic mustard relatively. How do you rank the invasiveness of garlic mustard versus dog strangling vine overall?
Yeah, I mean, having worked with these invasive plants more as a biocontrol person in the last 10 years, excuse me, you know, I find the plants themselves, so garlic mustard, it's very, I wouldn't say patchy, but it's very specific where it is. Dog strangling vine, similarly, and sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. I was surprised to see all the extent of knotweed in the ravines, because I had not heard anyone talking about it in the city over the last 10 years until we went down, and you just go, oh, wow. My colleague Bert Blossie in Cornell, who has worked a lot on garlic mustard and earthworms, and I always say he's the one that got me into earthworms, because he said, I'll give you $1,000 if you can find garlic mustard without earthworms. So I'm passing that on to, we have to split it if anyone finds any like that. But I never did find sites that had garlic mustard without earthworms.
Is
So
there a way? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
sorry, I think there's connection, you know, like there are linkages and facilitation in some cases. And I don't know if that's true for knotweed, or sorry, well, knotweed, but dog strangling vine. I'm coming back to the original question. Like I see knot or dog strangling vine quite a bit on abandoned farmlands or areas that were cultivated, either pasture or crops. And then they move into forested areas. And of course, trails, etc., promote that. I haven't worked as much with garlic mustard. And my colleague Bernd always says after 15 years, garlic mustard starts to disappear. I don't know. That's his version in upstate New York. Anyway, your question?
So is there a way to control the earthworms, invasive earthworms?
No. And that's been the most humbling work I've done, I think, is working with earthworms. Like, you know, as a biocontrol person, you can kind of say we can sort of mitigate the impacts of some of these invasives. Like we may never get rid of dog strangling vine or purple loosestrife or whatever. Like as a biocontrol person, you say, okay, they're here to stay only at lower levels so that we keep our habitats intact and sort of retain as much ecological integrity as we can. But earthworms, I mean, they are here. There's nothing to get rid of them, and they are very quiet, and they continue to move very slowly. And the argument might be, I mean, if you can get down on that because we brought them in from Europe and Asia with us. Everyone knows they're good for the garden. So they've been brought in. But on the other hand, there were earthworms in the southern US below the glaciation space that were moving anyway. So worms were going to come. They probably would have come a lot slower if we hadn't moved them around. But I mean, back to this humbling, like they were coming anyway. We're just now have to deal with them because we've accelerated that movement. And of course, we brought species that wouldn't have normally have come. So the humbling part for me is that ecologically the world changes, and let's try and work with it in a better way.
Interesting. And a comment here, lack of root space is a huge issue given parking pads, monster homes, intensification. There's lots of non-native small trees being planted, especially Bradford pear and Japanese tree lilac. I've noticed them starting to reproduce during my biological inventory work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and that's the thing. The ones that are surviving are the ones that can survive in tough spaces. I mean, that's why Norway maple has done so well. And the ravines, as they're shifting, I mean, the maple tends, because of shade tolerance, but also the ability to survive with kind of exposed roots and fragile, like really not strong, good soil space. So anyway, yeah, yes, I agree. It's partly what's leading to a decline in tree size if you look across the city, and that's not the ravines per se, but just people always, I sort of look at trees in the city of Toronto, or what I call teenagers. We never really let them get very old for many reasons, just because of the conflict with risk in humans, and like the ice storm that's just happened in Quebec. I mean, there are real challenges to having them in the landscape safely.
And what is the impact of off-road vehicles like ATVs on hastening erosion? Is there existing bylaws and level of enforcement?
Good question. I don't really know that. I mean, there's no doubt about it in my mind how quickly it hastens, declines the integrity of the soil. I mean, I talk about trees and the ecological integrity, and I failed to say much about the soil other than the images show that the soil is critical to all of this. And you have that kinds of impacts, compaction and runoff. As soon as you get the compaction, which earthworms also contribute to, but as soon as you get that heavy, intense use, yeah, it's difficult. But you know, I think I was talking to someone the other day. We know that if you were able to build wooden pathways or, you know, above, like, that have reduced impact on the soil, that there's new plastic, I don't know if it's plastic, but compounds, biomaterials that can be sort of put on the surface that don't impact the soil in the same way. We know these work, it's just money. I mean, it is about money. So the question is, sometimes we know what to do, and I think I was trying to make that point, is we know that things aren't as good as they could be, and we know they're heading in the wrong direction. And we even know some sort of mechanical or technological solutions, but the problem is who's responsible. That often falls through the cracks. And how do we all come to kind of work together on it? Sometimes it's volunteers and citizens scientists, or citizen scientists, and sometimes it's the city. So this is why we like the conservancy model. It's what our report actually focused on, is say we need to somehow bring the public and private sectors together. And I think the Ravines in Toronto really flags that, because they are a responsibility of us all.
All right. All right. Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Sandy. I think we're going to wrap up here because it's 1 o'clock.
Great.
But that was really interesting, and thank you very much for presenting today.
Great. Thank you. I really appreciate it, and hopefully it was informative. An update on the City of Toronto.
Right. And if people have any questions, any further questions, they can contact you, right at your email.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. And just a quick note before we wrap up, all of the previous webinar recordings and slides should now be posted on the website. So just be sure to check our website to access some of our previous presentations. And thank you everyone again for joining, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you. Goodbye.